So, Solar Opposites is a new TV show from one, which is an important distinction to make, of the creators of Rick and Morty, Justin Roiland. This show is essentially Rick and Morty. There's not any better way to say it.
We may be trapped on this world that's on the brink of mass extinction, but while we're here, at least we have each other.
And we can wear matching costumes and compete in fashion shows.
Nope,
just
nope,
two
I'm
friends
covering my
holding
ears.
hands
I don't
down
want
the
to hear
street.
this.
So this is the new Hulu original from Justin Roiland, who again was the co-creator of Rick and Morty, which is one of the most beloved animated television shows in the last, I don't know, ever. It's such a great show about just family dynamics, random pseudo-sciencey things, and breaking down writing formulas and breaking down tropes of other TV shows or of movies.
Oh yeah, you gotta get swifty.
It's a really quick-witted, intelligent show that is fully aware of what it is and what it wants to be. The show seems to know exactly what lane it's in, and it just completely fills that lane perfectly. It's a really entertaining show, and I know the stigma around it right now is that it's cool to dislike it because the fans that like it are so rabid and kind of horrifying to see.
I'm Pickle Rick!
But it is a legitimately great show. It's very well written, the voice acting is great, it's got sharp dialogue, it's really funny, it's really quick-witted, it's just a really entertaining, weird show that just does kind of whatever it wants. It beats to the tune of its own drum. And Solar Opposite is very similar in at least the latter part of that description of Rick and Morty, in that it is kind of its own thing, but this is very clearly a Rick and Morty clone. Even though one of the co-creators of Rick and Morty is creating the show, it still just feels like an off-brand version of Rick and Morty. And I think the biggest reason for that is because it is both styled very similarly. It's like when Seth MacFarlane makes a new show and all of his shows look similar in art style. That's what Solar Opposites is. Its art style is almost identical to that of Rick and Morty. You got the little butthole eyes, the kind of crude animation style. It's incredibly similar in that respect, and so the comparisons to Rick and Morty and Solar Opposites are comparable just on the visual front of it. And the visuals aren't bad. Obviously, the show looks great, it has a big budget, and it is very similar to Rick and Morty's style. But the thing that I think is even more comparable between these two shows is the dialogue, the weird situations the characters get in, and the hyper-violence.
We're unlikable, aren't we? Is it the sci-fi stuff? Do I smell bad? What is it?
With a little extra effort, I think we can up our likability. Are you ready to do what it takes?
You mean sex stuff?
That's possible, yeah.
Then yes.
Which is sort of a crux of Rick and Morty, these hyper-violent situations that they get themselves into. It's very graphic, it's very brutal and gory. But this show seems to rely very heavily on said violence, which is one of my biggest issues with it. It feels like the show sometimes doesn't know what to do or how to finish scenes, so instead of finishing a scene, it just ends with something super violent happening for not great reasons. I mean, even in episode 1, there is people getting torn limb from limb, this guy gets sucked into this kind of demonic mouth and gets chewed up right in front of the camera, they pull off a girl's head and pour Diet Coke on her brain. Like, it's really gruesome stuff, but it doesn't feel earned. It doesn't feel like it's rooted in anything but just being violent. Now, again, Rick and Morty is super violent, but it feels like it's almost a last option for the characters. They would rather not be violent. They would rather just do their thing and have no one bother them. But this show, it seems like the opposite. It seems like they want nothing more than to be violent, which makes it kind of hard to relate to and hard to get invested in, because the characters, I mean, they're all aliens, which is a fine enough premise. You can have characters that aren't humans and you can still make them relatable and interesting, but a lot of the characters feel the same. And that's another issue I have with it besides the violence, is that a lot of the writing for the characters is not varied up enough to make them feel distinct.
I thought you weren't shrinking kids down anymore.
These are adults. They love it.
Mr. Janitor.
That's one thing I really love about Rick and Morty, is that every single character seems to have a distinct trait to them that makes them instantly recognizable and instantly relatable. I mean, the main family in that is, you know, Rick, Morty, Summer, and their parents, and every single one of them has distinct traits, whether that's a stereotypical trait or not. Every single one, you know that character just by the way they talk and just by the way the things they do is distinctly them. But in Solar Opposites, it's the opposite. A lot of these characters just like blend into themselves in such a way that none of them feel that distinct. They all start to feel very similar, not just because the writing is really similar for all of them, but the delivery of the dialogue too is really similar across the board. I mean, the actors all do a fine job, but it all is delivered in this really fast Rick and Morty type way, like,
"We're what's left." What a family.
At least we're real, Jerry. We're real. Ricky Tikki Tavi!
Cleared from outer space.
You're the one who chose to land
My
here.
scans didn't indicate it was a human-infested crab hole without a single redeeming value, Terry.
it's just, all the characters just feel one note. And that's sort of the biggest issue this has, is that you don't care. You just don't care, because a lot of the situations they get in are similar to Rick and Morty. They're zany, they're wacky, they're goofy, and they're funny situations. It's just that the characters that are inhabiting the situations aren't. They're not fun, they're not wacky, they're not goofy in their own ways. They're just those very broad terms put on top of these Rick and Morty type characters. It's like watching a spin-off of Rick and Morty that isn't as fun or interesting. It's actually kind of like if one of the interdimensional cable TV shows was made into an actual TV show.
Who could have done something like this? It's a travesty. I did. You see this knife and all the blood on it? Here's my fingerprints.
Guilty. I sentence you to life in prison.
Here's another quick mystery.
My mother's dead.
And I killed her. Here's the weapon, and cuff me, thank you very much.
And I think a lot of that has to do with Dan Harmon. He's not like the greatest writer of all time, but he knows how to construct a scene, and he knows what characters should be doing things at any given point. He knows that this distinct character would be funny in this situation because it's like a mirror of their personality, or it's so opposite them, then the comedy easily comes from those situations. Now, maybe that's because Dan Harmon kind of came up in the comedy television scene. I mean, he wrote a lot of Community. He knows what the scene should be, and either he does the opposite of that or he makes fun of that formula. He constantly is doing this, which makes every episode feel fresh because they seem to be flipping a new thing on its head and seeing what hilarity comes from that. But this is not really that. It's like all these aliens are living on Earth. Sometimes they don't want to be there, sometimes they do, and sometimes they care too much about what people think of them, and sometimes they don't. It's just not consistent. And that's why I think Rick and Morty works so well, is because you have, again, consistent characters, you have these consistent situations they get themselves into, everything remains consistent, and you get character growth in that consistency, because you understand where they are in point A, and you understand what got them to point B. Solar Opposites is like watching point A, and then you go to point C, and then back to B, and then they kind of go back to A for a minute, and then they go over to D. It's like, it's completely all over the place.
Is that the children's hospital? Man, you don't really think of them blowing up like that. I mean, what are they storing? Giant tanks of flammable liquid?
Now let's get out of here before we get arrested for all this shit.
I went into this, I saw the trailer for it, and I went into it saying, okay, it looks like Rick and Morty, but it looks like at least the characters are gonna be a little bit different, and the situations look a little bit more, not grounded, but less over the top. Like in Rick and Morty, they go to different planets, they go to different dimensions. It's very over the top in that sense, but this show takes place mostly on Earth, so it is grounded in that way, but the situations are way less interesting because of that. I mean, you can have these situations where they do everyday human things, and that's kind of funny because they're not humans, but that seems to be the only type of comedy that the show has. And aside from that, it is over-reliant on gore and cursing to kind of make up for that lack of depth or that lack of intrigue. So overall, I think the show is a little weak. I don't love it, but I don't hate it either. It's one of those weird shows where You can see a lot of elements of what they wanted to do, or what joke they wanted to present, or what they wanted to accomplish. And they do accomplish it in the most bare minimum way possible, which is not what I expected from a show that a guy attached to one of the best animated shows in recent memory would come up with. It's just a really bizarre, unflattering, and unappealing show. Even though it's not bad, it's just not that interesting. So, I don't know. I don't know what to say other than if you like Rick and Morty and you want to see more of Rick and Morty, but done in a less intriguing and less smart or clever way, then you should watch this. It is a lot like Community in that when Dan Harmon was writing it, you can tell when he was writing it, and you can tell when he left the show because the quality just drops through the floor. And that is similar here. It doesn't drop so hard that it's unwatchable, but it is distinctly different in not a good way. So yeah, I mean, will I watch it going forward? Probably. But I'm not gonna hang on every episode like I do Rick and Morty. When a Rick and Morty episode comes out, I am there as soon as it airs, because I can't wait to see what new thing they've come up with what new characters they're gonna run into. I can't wait to see what they're gonna write next. And here, I'm like, I watched the first 2 episodes and I felt like I got exactly what the show was for the entire season. I felt like I didn't even need to watch the rest, even though I did. But yeah, just weird.